Okay, then it's computer. Perfect.
Cool. I'll share my screen then, because that make things a bit simpler for me. Cool. Can everybody read what is on my screen? I have a fairly huge one, so happy to increase font size. All good? Okay. So I just want to do like a 5-minute demo. And if it takes 10 minutes, please forgive me. But for those who haven't seen what Isorun does and what it can do and why it works that specific way. And then I talked with wrote with Lena before, and then we do just like Q&A and rip it apart, if that makes sense. Cool. So it all started with this RFC. So first of all, I'm fairly new to GitLab. So I joined like in April this year. And one of the things that were kind of like confusing to me, from an outsider perspective, is like, why is there no server-side rendering for GitLab's UI? And mostly for performance reasons. And then over time I learned, there were like several attempts to roll out server-side rendering, not just one. And I think, I don't want to generalize, but I think they all share a common theme. It's like really hard to do it at GitLab for several reasons. One of them is infrastructure, which I partially try to solve with Isorun, and there might be a few others that I don't solve, but we can't solve all the problems at once. So the basic idea is, instead of running a dedicated Node.js service, I want a server-side render directly in a Ruby process. So some of you might ask, how is this even possible? The cool thing about V8 is that it's an open source library. It's written in C, so you can just embed it into your Ruby gems. Ruby is written in C. We are running Ruby on MRI, which is a C interpreter / compiler. So you can just run C code. And instead of running a dedicated Node.js service where you have to proxy all the requests, or Dino service or a bun service, doesn't really matter, where you proxy all the requests through that service, where you have to deal with authentication and security implications, why not just use the existing infrastructure and kind of like enhance it a bit with JavaScript capabilities? So that's the basic idea of UI over the wire in Isorun. I want to show you like how it works, and I guess afterwards we can just like deep dive into if there are specific questions like how things are implemented, we can talk about them. So this is a Tailwind UI demo with a GraphQL API and using Vue 3 plus Apollo, the Compose API. So it's a fairly state-of-the-art stack in comparison to what we have at GitLab. It's overly simplified, but for demo purposes, it works pretty well. And when I reload here, you kind of see a lot of log output on the left side. This is my Ruby on Rails application. And here is our Tailwind app. And when I actually don't need to inspect because I already did it. We see like a few CSS files and JavaScript files downloaded. Here's the compiled, I use Webpack, but doesn't really matter. The bundled Vue application. And a bit more interesting, when we look at the source of that page, we see like a fully server-side rendered application. We see Apollo state written to a global variable, and we rehydrate with the client-side bundle version plus that Apollo state. So it's like the full server-side rendering loop, I would say. The way this works from a developer perspective is, let's assume this is the most simple Rails application you can think of, like Rails new. You install the gem. You kind of decide where you want to put your Vue application. So we have Isorun app here. I see an app identifier. The identifier is just from the asset pipeline in Ruby on Rails. So we have a JavaScript file here that's called app.js, and we have a server version of that. By convention, I just use -server. So this is the way it finds the server version and the client version, but fully configurable. That's pretty much all you need to do in order to render the app. Where it gets more interesting in terms of why is this better than a Node.js service, or is this actually better than a Node.js service? We can do fancy things if we are already within the Ruby process. What we can do is we can actually call Ruby functions from the JavaScript world. And you might think, why do I need that? And there's one reason that makes it really, really desirable to do that. It's when we have network requests. So if we think about a Vue application just as a template engine, we don't need that. But Vue applications are way more than that, right? And we do a lot of GraphQL requests. And what if we could just avoid having a network round trip to the server and instead just directly execute the GraphQL controller action from the JavaScript application? So I want to show you how this is done. So this is the Apollo client, and it has one specific extra. When we are server-side rendering here, I override the fetch function from HTTP link options. And this fetch function calls the Dino, it's called Dino because I use the Dino Rust libraries for that, but it actually just calls a Ruby function called onAppSend and forwards all the JavaScript values, objects, information to the Ruby world. And in Ruby, we do have a message receiver where we can decide what to do with it. So in this case, take the input, execute the GraphQL query on the server, and return a result. What we could do here as well, we could cache stuff. So if I put in a Rails cache, just want to make a simpler example. It's the most basic GraphQL API. So if we return data, test field, hello foundations team, and I return a JSON. And I should learn to code. And I restart this thing. I have to restart because it's an initializer, and I obviously have done something wrong. Does someone see my error? I don't see it.
I think there's an extra N there, no? Right after the comment.
Ah, okay, thanks. Live demos. So I need to disable JavaScript, otherwise we're actually using the real API afterwards. So we see hello foundations team. So the actual GraphQL query is not going through the HTTP network, it's directly calling from the JavaScript runtime into the Ruby process. So there's no faster way of rendering stuff on the server if you can avoid network round trips and everything. Yeah, so that's kind of like the feature set. Server-side rendering in Ruby with Vue. There's a few more applications, like you can do multi-apps. Just demo it. If you do something stupid, you see like the app is rendered twice. Not really useful, but if you think about having a sidebar and an app and a top navigation bar all built in Vue and you want to render it at once, it's also possible. There's a few things that are still missing, like state merging, and obviously the library needs to be mature before we could ship it. But yeah, that's the basic idea. And happy to answer all the questions if there are. I hope there are some.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I don't have access. No, I have access to the document, but we don't have notes yet. So I can ask the first question. Yes. So I think the sidebar, as we are planning it, is a super cool use case for that. I just have concerns about querying, because a thing that you just, for example, said, like, hey, we need to turn off JavaScript to show that we're not querying, kind of thing, right? I have the fear that this means that if we're working with this, we need a lot of knowledge and need to be super careful not to do stupid things. In the sense, for example, we've learned that counts are super expensive, and the thing in the sidebar is we have counts. right? And so what could happen is that we have like super expensive queries in on the server-side rendering. Then we do the same queries again once we hydrate the thing and the app is bootstrapped and whatnot, right? And so the question is, if we, the question is, if we do this, we need to be like super careful not to do stupid stuff on the server-side rendered version, right? And I think that's just tricky. Yeah, just a concern, basically.
Yeah, but that's a concern that is independent from the implementation of server-side rendering, right? Like it's just a server-side rendering issue, period.
Yes, but
okay.
The thing is just basically we're handing us a potential foot gun here, right? That's what I'm saying, right? Like, and the question is, do we shoot, you know, the Sparrow's cannon thing, you know? Is this because yes, this is super cool for from a technical perspective, but the question is it really needed? That's just the thing. And because there are so many potential problems from where it's super easy to mess something up. We're doing it right now, for example, right? Like, so if you suddenly write like something super expensive in Rails right now and add it to navigation and it's loaded on every page, we don't have good tooling to detect that on the right now either. Or like automatic, you know, hey, you added like, I don't know, a to-dos count that's super expensive. And now suddenly the page load takes 15 seconds. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay, there's a few things in there. I would like to separate the problems. This does not solve any performance problem that you already have. Like that's not possible. The only thing that it solves is like, you can gradually migrate into server-side rendering, and you have to figure out how to do this properly. Like that's not a magical solution. It just solves all the problems that we have. Like if a GraphQL request takes 5 seconds to resolve, it's still going to take 5 seconds to resolve. And to be quite frank, we don't want a server-side rendering for a request that takes 5 seconds. Instead, we should skip it. That's personal opinion. Like if the server takes longer than 100 milliseconds to respond, I think it's a bug, not a performance issue. When it comes to doing something stupid, because you have like more power to do stuff, that's obviously true. Like you can't prevent people from initializing their own HTTP clients and using custom fetch functions. The question is, can we isolate the initialization of clients and fetch clients into a single place? And I think we do that already. We have an Apollo client in a single place. And I think a regular developer should never touch this function after it has been created once. It's one way of like avoiding network overhead, but it does not solve the problem of actually executing an action. That's not something you can solve here. I think the first question was, do we really need it? From a technical perspective, it's cool. I think from first principles, it's the right thing to do, because server-side rendering is by definition the only way it's the fastest way to serve a website. You cannot serve it any faster than that. The reason is that browsers stream render HTML, and the alternative is to load down a JavaScript file and then you execute it. So it's never going to be faster than that. And I think that's the primary reason I would like to introduce server-side rendering.
I'm going to skip my first question because it kind of ties into what you just spoke about here. But like, are we not just shifting left a lot of this, these load times? And then, so at the moment we've got, if you look at an issues page, we load the page and then we show that your issues are loading in. Whereas if we were doing this server side, we would have a white screen until all of that data is there, and then it gets shipped down the line. Like it is faster overall, but that kind of perceived performance of things loading in at different times is still a concern, right?
Yeah, if you can't load within a certain amount of time, it does not make sense to server-side render. That's like, I would say 100 milliseconds is an acceptable response time, but everything that is slower than that it does not make sense. What I believe might be a good first, like if the application frame could be server-side rendered to begin with, let's just make an assumption, right? Then you have like the loading skeletons for the issues. That might be an acceptable way of doing it. The way Apollo handles that in server, when you render server side, is you can skip queries on the server. That's the most common way of doing it. At least that's what I know that other companies are doing.
Server side render the critical parts that don't take long to load, and then we can still use the deferred rendering for the other things.
Yeah, I mean, it ties back to the. I don't want to like extend the scope too much, but I think we have an API problem or a database problem, but we can't solve that on the front end, right? We can like we can reduce perceived load times. We can make it a bit less annoying to wait for a list of issues when it takes a bit longer. But the original problem here is load times from the database. And if you would do a Rails application with a Rails view and you would try to load the issues and then present it to the user, you would have the exact same problem. It's a very different problem, I think. And we kind of like package a bit nicer with loading skeletons. That's perfectly fine. But it's not something server-side rendering will ever solve. Like you can't make the database faster with that.
I have a question as well. Like, is there any sense that like if we put aside the question whether we need it or not, is there any technical obstacles at this moment whether we can create a POC for the sidebar, for instance, like at this moment?
I mean, this is technically, this is not a trivial thing, right? Like this is a Rust native extension. It embeds V8, like the whole library. And you can obviously do a lot of stupid things there because you get full control over the JavaScript runtime. So I would not trust myself at this stage to put this into production. That said, though, I'm currently working on adding Rust to GitLab's codebase for a different reason. And in order to ship this, we need to be able to compile Rust in CI. And we need to add it to our Omnibus installers and Helm charts and I don't know what else. There's a couple of things. So that's a prerequisite to ship the gem because the native extension needs to be built at install time. Besides that, we could, and this is what I think Thomas is working on the sidebar, or I at least replied to a comment in the sidebar issue. I would like to try an actual GitLab page with it, just to see the difficulties when implementing something real. But it's, to be quite clear, this is a pet project of mine that I'm not even doing within my working hours, so it's a bit slower than you might expect from someone who is doing that full time.
I think we've gone in a strange order in the notes. I'm a bit lost as to where we are. I think you basically just answered the next question that's in there. This is basically, the example's great. I love it, but the step that always tripped us up, as we've said before, we've tried this a few times, is when we try and actually use it on GitLab, on GitLab's infrastructure, on the GitLab project, all that sort of thing. Like, have you tried it in there yet with anything, even something daft? Like,
no, not at all. I have talked to a few people, in particular Andrew, about infrastructure implications and how we could roll it out, but I haven't tried, like converting a full GitLab page and just like doing server-side rendering. I think I'm getting closer to try it, like I'm not quite there yet, and that would definitely be the next step, to just have a demo with an actual GitLab page. But yeah, something like that does not exist yet, a demo for that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the reason why we all seem a little apprehensive. Like, it's great, and if it works, it'd be amazing. But we've been here before, we've been bitten, and
Yeah,
we
so
get
this is
excited, and then something happens with infrastructure, and we
this is
can't. Right?
so when I'm talking to folks, especially product managers, engineering managers, I think there is there's like an unreasonable expectation that people just bring a final like, you know, that's a somewhat complex problem, and you know, everybody kind of like thinks, oh, if we can get this as a low-hanging fruit, we're kind of like, yeah, we will do it. The reality is this needs a team to work on it, and someone needs to decide to make an investment. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And you know, and it will stay a pet project of mine. And if no one is willing to invest in this, it's not going to happen. That's the simple answer.
Yeah, I think that's the point, right? Like, it's not a quick fix, it's not a quick win. It is it's a whole thing in itself, right?
Yeah, I have a bit of a background story about server-side rendering at a relatively large scale application. Like, it's a way larger application than GitLab is, but we took a different approach back then. We migrated the whole code base towards React and built a Node.js server-side rendering service just for that. And it was a strategical decision to do that, not, you know, an ambitious engineer trying to get server-side rendering done. That takes an organization to do it. I mean, I keep poking, but don't expect magic from me.
No, we don't. I mean, this is it, right? Like, it because it's such a big thing and there's no guarantee that it'll work, it's going to be really difficult to try and get people to buy in, which is why we're also a little apprehensive, right? We've got this navigation. We don't, like, I think it's maybe a good thing to test it with, and it would be a good use case for it. But I think my worry is that we go down this route and that blocks us rolling out the navigation, and that's going to be a really hard thing to kind of sell. If that makes sense.
The way I recommend to approach this is, let's do the demo, because I think that's like, I have enough time to make it work with the sidebar, and then we can, I don't know, do some benchmarks that might not be statistically significant, but still be a bit more impressive than showing a Tailwind UI demo. And then it's up to someone. To decide to staff this as a small team of people that can actually work, that understand enough about, you know, low level machine stuff, memory management, how to deal with multi-threading. That's not. I mean, Cloudflare workers is pretty much the same challenge. I don't think a single person did that at Cloud. I know that at Cloudflare, actually, a single person came up with the idea and built the demo, but the product that they released is not a single person's product. So that's the same challenge. It's the same complexity, and it needs to be approached that way. But that's not a technical problem, right? Like, that's very independent from that.
I also think if you're looking for people who can do low-level machine code, you're definitely talking to the wrong team. We are most front-end engineers here. I think we'll happily use it, but
yeah. You know, I don't want to create like a bad. Don't want to turn down the mood. It's just, you can't use that right away. Like, that's not possible. And I might exaggerate a bit, but I think that's I'm not sure how this works. Like, how do you get stuff on the roadmap? Because there's the RFCs, for example, there's a ton of good RFCs, and there's no investment in it, or at least not that I see it. So I don't know how you get technical advancements, like technical enhancements onto the roadmap or next year's fiscal plans, right? But the only thing I can do is like show it to more people, and, you know, people can decide if it, from first principles, and this is important to me, does it make sense to have server-side rendering or not, and should we invest in it or not? I think that's the real question to answer. And if performance is a feature from a product perspective, we eventually will have to do it. Maybe next year, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 3 years, I don't know. I think, if you look a bit outside of GitLab, it's not a question that server-side rendering is the one thing that you have to do. The other solution, I think this is what folks are currently working on, is having like an offline capable application that use service workers, and then you kind of accept that the first request is just slow, and then everything else is kind of cached. Also, not a trivial project, but yeah, those are the options.
I think, yeah, it's tricky to get investment on these things. I think the group that you're in, the incubation team, is maybe a good spot for this. Like,
you might think so.
I don't know. Like, it's that kind of, the whole point of it is that we can hack away on something and then potentially throw it away if it doesn't work and it's not that big of an investment, right? Which is kind of where this falls. I am curious. Yeah. It sounds like from your response, this is something you've already brought up with Bartek.
Oh yeah, for sure. I did.
Where did that go?
I think, and I'm not sure how much you know about incubation engineering, but it's pretty much Sid has an idea, we hire someone for it, and then he builds it. And this is always a product feature and mostly a reactive one. So, Copilot, for example, was a project, and real-time collaboration is my actual project that I'm working on, not server-side rendering. And yeah, we don't, it's not really we don't come up with new ideas and then just do it. That's I wish it would be the case, and I could make a case for server-side rendering, and have like a small blast radius demo on GitLab, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, I think outside of incubation, maybe Tim Zolman's a good person to speak to. Like, I think he's been involved in a lot of these before.
Tim Zolman?
Tim Zolman, yes.
Yeah. I talked to him already. It's a while back, but I talked to him, yeah. I also try to convince everyone I meet.
We just now need to make this idea Sid's idea. So if Sid wants SSR, so we get it.
I brought it up with Sid, it's like, yeah, it's a nice idea. Next thing. So 5 seconds of attention you get for that, but there's no commitment, right? Like, you need someone committing to it. Would be great if the foundations team has capacity for that, but I think you folks have like 20 other things to do, right?
We are definitely at capacity, to put it politely.
Yeah, I just wonder, is there like I guess like you want server-side rendering if you could get it somehow easily into the system, right? Like that's
if we could snap our fingers and it worked perfectly and there was no nonsense that came with it, right? Then yes, but I don't think that's going to happen exactly like that, right? Like Lucas said earlier, it's an extra layer of complexity that we don't have the expertise on right now, and it's going to slow us down a little bit trying to figure this out, and we can do a lot of things wrong. I think everyone's a little apprehensive to sort of take on this big thing in the fear that we do start to get things a little bit wrong. Like,
yeah, makes sense.
I don't know. And this is why the navigation is both a great use case for this and a terrible one, right? Because if we mess up the navigation, that's a problem. I think it's a good use case for it, but it's not a good project for it, right?
Do you folks know if there is like a performance initiative eventually for GitLab, like a performance as a feature? I mean,
continuously, and I think that the problem is that we are so far away on so many pages from like that this would make a meaningful difference, because if we already spend 600 milliseconds on database queries, and with the time to first byte, there are other things to optimize before you look at the server-side rendering, right? And personally, I would say if we get the server-side rendering and mainly use it for the navigation as the only use case, then I would not say that it's worthwhile, because I'd rather take the time that we spend on this, like, you know, the people power that we spend on this, and be like, hey, yeah, we're going to build the navigation once in Vue and like a skeleton loader version of it once in Haml, write some custom tests that the outputs match, and all good, right? Obviously, if there are that equation would change if we see that a lot of other pages would benefit from this, right? But if in the end we change our Vue apps to mostly render not that much, right? Or like the initial high-graded thing, you know, that basically the initial high-graded thing is not the fully functional app because like some pieces are missing, then the question would be, is it worthwhile? I don't know if there are like good candidates for pages where we know that, you know, hey, this whole page is Vue rendered and the database query just takes 20 milliseconds. So it would be an ideal candidate to server-side render it. I don't know if there are like any page like that. Yeah. And if there are pages like that, I have the assumption that they're probably not very important pages. Like, it probably doesn't make a difference if you server-side render the approval settings page, right? While, you know, I assume that that a lot of the high traffic important pages like issue lists and so on are probably also expensive from a database side. But I don't know. That's just my gut feeling here.
Yeah, I think this is a common mistake that companies make when they introduce server-side rendering. That they do it and then they have like 1 second page loads because the query takes like 80% of the time. Like it's completely useless if you're exceeding like a certain budget. Like actually useless because there's no benefit to it then.
Yeah, and that's the question, because if you, I think we somewhere have in Grafana, we somewhere have dashboards about how long certain pages render. I just looked in our debug there and clicked the 5 fastest pages from an LCP standpoint, and all of them had a time to first byte larger than 400 milliseconds, right? So I think if we're talking about a magical threshold of 100 milliseconds, there are probably not a lot of pages.
I mean, it's kind of tricky, right? Like it's technically still better, but you also need to fix the queries. I mean, that's we should fix the queries anyways. That's what I'm saying. But,
yes. Yeah.
There's probably a lot of work to do before this happens, right? That's not a problem, a big one.
It's like them cars you see driving past with the big spoilers on and the fancy lights and all of that, but it's just a tiny Vauxhall Corsa with a garbage engine. Like if you wanted to go faster, you fix the engine. You don't put spoilers and skirts on, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is really interesting. Like if the application frame plus navigation is not does not give a better user experience, right? Like that's the assumption here. If you can render the application frame instantaneously within 100 milliseconds, and then people can start clicking before the rest of the page is loaded, that might be a bit better. But yeah, it's obviously not the full story.
It's also a little bit unclear from an UX perspective if that is even desired. So we were talking about recently, and Sam looked at like 10 large pages, and if you load them, a lot of them load the navigation rather late, right? And my argument in discussions with Sam also was like, hey, if the navigation is so important that it needs to be rendered first, it probably just means that your overall navigation is shit, because you need like 10 clicks through the navigation to get where you want to be, because otherwise I'm going to a page and I want the content of the page first before I care about the navigation, right? Like if my first interaction within 100 milliseconds is navigating away, something else is wrong, right? It was at least my argument when we discussed it, and yeah, and so that's I think we obviously, because we're working on a navigation right now, we're focusing on it. The UX designers are focusing on it since months. Obviously, for us, the navigation is the most important piece, and the question is that really true? And if it is true, what kind of pieces of the navigation are the most important things, right? And yeah, this is probably also something where we don't have clear data at the moment. Yeah.
And I mean, and you still don't solve. You still do not solve the single page problem, right? Like this is. I haven't thought too much about it, but at Shopify we had initial page load times instrumented and then subsequent page visits. And there's like a big difference between those, right? Like when you're already within the app and then, have 20 milliseconds page loads and the initial page load takes like 100. But that's not possible if you don't have a single page application concept. That also is different at GitLab, is what I'm saying. So there's like a lot of things that are quite different than in other applications. It kind of makes me sad though. I think it should be a more uniform stack. It should be a bit better in general. Someone can dream.
I think that's kind of the core of the problem. Like it's a lot of investment for something that might be beneficial, but also might not, but will definitely be difficult to do. Like, I don't know. I think what you've done is great. I think it's really cool to be able to render. I don't even know how that works. I know you explained it, but like rendering JavaScript in Ruby is blowing my mind a little bit. I think it's a great thing separate to all this. It's just going to be really difficult to get the time that you need to do it properly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also just the only reason why I did it this way, and I can be honest with you folks, is this tricks Ruby people into believing that Ruby is still a thing, even when we actually do Vue. And for front-end folks, it's kind of acceptable that because it's still V8. So technically, it's something like Node.js. So they might accept it. I'm trying to make a joke here, but I have seen like front-end and back-end people kind of like colliding a bit sometimes when they talk about how things should be done.
To be honest, like I would push back on that because I like being the dumb front-end person, just dealing with Rails APIs. And if it's slow, the backend engineer is responsible. I personally don't even like GraphQL because it shifts like the blame of slow queries to me, right? So yeah.
But that's the point, right? Like you don't have to do anything. Like the idea is that you still have your Vue application. You don't need to care about anything else. It's like it's tricking the front-end developer into believing it's the same thing as a Node.js process, where you can just put your Vue application and it renders. Yeah, that is the whole idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we recently started looking, for example, like Miguel started looking into our GraphQL batching for one of his pages and saw that like a critical query that's actually fast because of batching takes a little bit longer, right? And I don't know. It's shifting this whole thing. I have the fear because at the moment, the boundary of backend and frontend at GitLab is sometimes like the HAML rendering is not treated well, right? Because backend engineers feel like, oh no, this is a frontend thing, and frontend engineers are like, oh no, this is a backend thing. And I have the fear that if we do a server-side rendering, that the whole thing becomes like nobody wants to touch it, right?
It's all backend and when it's server rendered, right?
Yeah.
I added one question late, Hannes. I think partly you answered it, but is there anything that, like assuming at some point we're gonna remove all the roadblocks and we actually can have this, be there anything that we would then benefit, like code style or code patterns that we do today, where you say, okay, it would be better not to do this, so it works better with ISO-run, I don't know, something regarding GraphQL or how we utilize Webpack today So it's like similar to how we prepare for Vue.js 3 eventually, so that we already do bits and pieces today, maybe.
So to be, that's an excellent question, and because the question is excellent because I don't have a correct answer for it, and the reason is I don't know Vue good enough. In general, like I tried to build demos with React Vue, multiple Vue apps on a single page, like to cover a few of the use cases. But at the end of the day, what I did is I was following the instructions from the Vue.js documentation, how to set up server-side rendering properly, what they need to consider for rehydration, make components capable of server-side rendering. And that's pretty much all I did in order to make it work. So I think everything that applies to server-side rendering in general would also apply to EasyRun. And the reason is so the way it's implemented, I use Deno Core, which is just a wrapper around V8, but adds web APIs. So you get like HTTP request response objects and classes, you get a fetch function, you get like all the nice web APIs that you need in order to actually make stuff like this work. And we can extend it. So that's pretty much the idea. What we could do in comparison to a Node.js service, because Node.js is doing all of that as well, right? Or Deno. What we could do is we could create like specific extensions for GitLab. So one of the extensions I built myself is talking to Ruby and to the GraphQL controller. But the risk of like writing too many extensions is that you create like specific server-side code that diverges from the front-end code, and you probably don't want it. What you actually want is a single file, and magically it gets bundled twice, once for server-side rendering, once for the client, and then it just works, right? Ideally. And so I would be a bit hesitant to ship too many specific extensions. I can think of one though that makes sense. And I think Stanislav was the one that brought it up. What if we want to render GitLab flavored Markdown on the server without blocking the actual render process? So what we could do is like having web workers even on the server side, and that's an interesting pattern I can think of.
Double blows my mind. So
I mean, it's really just V8. Like it's nothing fancy. It just connects Ruby with V8. That's what you have to keep in mind. You can do everything that you can do in V8 or in a JavaScript engine.
And
on a bit of C.
Since we focused so much on using this in GitLab, if I would start using this today in a greenfield new Rails app, either here for GitLab or just for fun, are there any hard dependencies? You mentioned earlier that the system you built this on needs a Rust support, right? But other than that?
GitLab needs Rust support, not everyone. And this has to do with how GitLab installs gems, because you can actually prepackage platform binaries. And if you have an x86 64 CPU, so 64-bit CPU, or a Darwin Apple M1 architecture, or an Apple x86 64, you don't need Rust because it's pre-bundled, prepackaged.
I see. Okay.
As soon as I release it, because I haven't done this yet. One platform that is missing is ARM64 Linux. And if I get that up and running, I think it covers the major platforms, and you could just use it.
Would cover all of mine, so yeah, please do that.
I want to use it myself. That's the reason I built it. But Thomas, I think we are talking tomorrow, right? A bit.
Yeah, I made our coffee chat appointment before I saw that we had this today as a team. So now you have to deal with me 2 days.
I'm going to show you how to set up a new Rails application from scratch with EasyRun in 5 minutes, because that's awesome. how long it takes.
Awesome.
Okay, I still have time for questions, but I think you folks are like the meeting was only scheduled for 30 minutes, right?
I had a quick one in terms of iteration, perhaps. Let's say that we were able to come up with a rough setup that works in production. Would we be able to feature flag it so that everyone gets the fully client-side rendered application by default, and a few of us can iterate on that? clunky server-side rendered thing.
I did not show it, but the tag helper that I use is fairly simple. It inserts the rendered application, and then it inserts the Apollo state, and then it inserts a script tag to the client bundle. So technically, if you have a feature flag that disables the server-side rendering part, it would be exactly the same as loading a JavaScript bundle and then render it on the client side. So that could be a potential way of introduce it. But the biggest blast radius is the gem itself when it loads, and you can't feature flag a gem. That's, I think, a fairly severe implication, and it could potentially blow up everything. I mean, maybe we sneak it in at some point. When I ship I'm working on another gem for GitLab that uses Rust and native extensions as well. When the first one is in, the second one is easier.
Okay, we are a bit over time. Thanks so much, Hannes, for doing the presentation, for answering our questions. Thanks everyone for joining. I guess this is it.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks for setting this up as well, Lenny.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.